Yeah, so sometimes you might not want to do things sequentially. Sometimes you might want to spice the program up a little bit. So now we're going to be talking about two types of control structures. We're going to be talking about loops, and we're going to be talking about conditional statements. So let's start with loops. So loops, as the name implies, allow you to loop over something. Often in programming, you will want to do something many times instead of just once. And you don't want to rewrite that thing over and over again in your program. So say you want to print a variable 10 times. You don't actually want to type out print variable 10 times, because that's absurd. So instead you just want to tell the program to do one thing 10 times. Python has two kinds of loops. And these kinds of loops are pretty universal in programming. So the first one is the for loop. So the for loop allows you to loop over some kind of iterable object. So this can be a list, this can be a string, anything that is made out of multiple things can be looped over using the for loop. So the syntax is, as you can see there, for placeholder variable name in whatever you're looping over, do something. So indeed, if we run this, we will print out each character of the string hello. Yes, so that's the general idea of how a for loop works. Now, often you may not want to be looping over one structure, but you want to be looping over multiple structures at once, for example. So let's say we have, we'll define a list that also has 5 elements. Let's say we want to loop over both of these, both over the string hello and over that list at once. And so then we can index into those objects explicitly. And the way you do that is a little bit hacky in Python, because of the fact that the for loop explicitly loops over an object, you need to generate a list of indexes that you then use to index into these things. So the way you do that in Python is by using the range function. So in this case, it'd be range 5. So range literally just generates a list that contains numbers from 0 to whatever number you put in there minus 1. So this range will generate a list that contains elements 0 through 4. And then you can use these indexes to do this, for example. So also here you see the bracket notation for indexing. And there we go. We go over the range list, and then we step the index into our list and our string at once. Yeah, so that's for loops. Those are the main two use cases. You'll be using for loops a lot. But there's also another kind of loop that I mentioned, which is the while loop. The while loop is very similar. It is an expressive power identical. You can express any for loop as a while loop and vice versa. But some cases may be more intuitive for one kind of loop or another. So the way that a while loop works is you write while, and then you give it some Boolean expression. So like the Boolean we saw earlier, a Boolean expression can be either true or false. So let's use so let's do n. So while n is less than 5, so what this will do, and this little loop, is it'll keep looping while n is less than 5, and at each step it'll add 1 to n. And so if you run that, you can see indeed that it went from 1 to 5. So a while loop basically just keeps going until the condition that you've given it becomes false, and then it stops. so those are the two basic types of loops. You'll be seeing a lot of both of them. Python, probably for loops are more common than while loops, but you will also see while loops, especially in contexts where you're not really sure how many elements you'll be working on, but you know that there's some condition that has to be true for you to be doing anything at all. So for example, if you're going to be reading in something from an input stream, you'll often use while loops because you don't know how much input you'll be getting quite a lot of the time. If at some point you ever do games programming, this is used quite a lot because you'll have things that you want to be happening all the time, pretty much, and then you use a while loop. Yeah, so any questions about looping so far? No? Right, so yeah, that's pretty much loops. Those are the basics. There's not really that much more to know about them. So now we go on to conditional structures. Often you'll have situations where you will have multiple cases. So in one case you might want to do one thing, but in another case you might want to do another thing. And that's when you start to use conditional structures. The conditional structures are if and else statements. And they work kind of similar to a while loop minus the loop. For example, and this is a very trivial example, but here we have some if and else if statements, and they work pretty much like you would expect. If you have an if statement, you give it some, again, Boolean expression. In this case, n is more than 4. If n is indeed more than 4, then your program will execute that line of code in the block under the if statement. Otherwise, it will ignore that statement entirely. So, for example, if n was less than 4, it wouldn't print n is bigger than 4. Else if statements are used to chain together multiple if statements. So for example, in this little block, if n is more than 4, then it will print I just made a bug there. Yeah, the second condition is wrong. But anyway, so the essential game is also if statements to chain together multiple if statements. So you can do if x, then do this, else, if another condition, do another thing. And else statements are use a sort of catch-all block. So if you have if n is bigger than 4, then do something, and then else in any other case, which in this case would be n is not more than 4, do something else. Now, the block I just introduced into this little program, and is a very good example, but you should always be careful when using if statements and else if statements. And also in particular, you need to be aware of the distinction between having multiple if statements in a row and having a chain of if else if statements, because their functionality will not always be identical, and often will not be. And sometimes you will want a bunch of if statements, sometimes you'll want a bunch of else if statements, so you need to be wary of that. So to give an example, let's say, so to run that, you get an else syntax.
It's cool. Missing.
Okay, that syntax. So, in this case, both if statements execute because they both get validated, and then both of them fulfill the condition, and is indeed bigger than 4 and bigger than 6, so you get both things printed out. So again, this is a trivial example, but in real situations, you can imagine you don't always want to be checking both of these statements. Sometimes what you're intending to do is just to if the first statement checks out, just do that and don't do anything else that's after it, in which case this would produce a bug, because it still does both of them. So now if we change that to an else statement, an else statement, then we can see that the second statement does not execute, because none of the elifs following the first if are ever evaluated if the first if checks out. So because n is indeed bigger than 4, the second condition never gets checked. So we can see how that's a sort of subtle thing. A lot of bugs have been introduced in programs because people leave dangling a statement somewhere. So be very careful about how you do that. Especially be very careful if you're nesting if statements together. So I probably wouldn't write it out here, but you can imagine where if I had another if statement inside the first block, those kind of situations can produce a lot of bugs. And I think that's probably most of the content we'll cover today. There are other conditional structures that you can use. In particular, case statements are pretty common. They're not very often used in Python because I don't think Python has inbuilt case statements. But that's something that you might see, which is essentially, case statements essentially work the same as if and else if statements, but are nicer to look at in some situations. And there are, depending on what modules you're using, there might be fancy indexing techniques for using conditional statements. We won't go into that here, but you will